20, 3 people one Christmas morning, a choice that would ring through Georgia for many years to come. What took place on that plantation was not just surprising. It was something that tested everything the authorities thought they knew about loyalty, desperation, and how far human beings will go when they are pushed past their breaking point. This is the true story of what those 23 souls did and why the real truth took decades to fully come out. Before we go on with the story of Riverside Plantation and the events that shook Georgia to its core, if you are interested in dark historical mysteries that mix fact with legend, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. You will not want to miss what happens next. Now, let us step back to the year 1847, to a place where silence held more secrets than words ever could. The Oconee River cut through middle Georgia like a silver mark. Along its eastern bank sat Riverside Plantation, 300 acres of cotton fields, trees, and red clay soil that turned to rust, colored mud every single winter. The big main house rose 3 stories high, with white columns shining in the sun, a statue of wealth built on the backs of those who would never walk through its front door. By December of 1847, Riverside had been in the Hartwell family for 42 years. James Hartwell III ran the business with the same strict discipline his father and grandfather had used, though neighbors whispered he had taken that discipline to places even his ancestors would not have gone. The plantation was home to 23 enslaved people, a small number compared to the huge farms closer to Savannah, but Hartwell liked it that way. Easier to control, he would say, and easier to watch. The enslaved community at Riverside lived in a row of cabins behind the main house. These were rough structures with gaps in the walls that let in the winter wind and the summer heat. Each cabin measured about 12 feet by 14 feet, housing anywhere from 3 to 6 people, depending on the size of the family. The floors were packed dirt that turned into mud when rain leaked through the bad roofs. A single fireplace in each cabin gave heat and space for cooking, but wood was limited. During the coldest months, people huddled together under thin blankets, their breath visible in the freezing air. There was Samuel, the oldest at 56, who had been born on the property and remembered James Hartwell II. His hands were twisted from decades of picking cotton, his back permanently bent from years of bending over in the fields, but his mind remained sharp, and younger workers often asked for his advice on matters both practical and spiritual. Samuel had seen 3 generations of Hartwells and had watched the plantation grow from a small farm to one of the richer ones in the county, and he understood the family's ways and weaknesses better than they understood themselves. Ruth worked in the main house, one of 3 people allowed inside the white columns and polished floors. She was 38 years old, light-skinned enough that rumors went around about who her father was. Rumors that were likely true, given James Hartwell II's known habits. Ruth saw things the field workers never did. She saw the family arguments, the money books left open on desks, and the letters from people demanding money that arrived more and more often. She heard conversations through doorways and learned secrets that could be useful if one knew how to use them. Her job gave her access, but it also kept her apart from the cabin community, making her look suspicious to both the white family and her fellow enslaved workers. Thomas was barely 19, tall and strong, with eyes that held a burning anger he had learned to hide behind a mask of obedience. His mother, Dinah, had been sold 3 years earlier to pay a gambling debt of James Hartwell. Thomas had watched her being loaded onto a wagon and heard her screams as she was driven away, and something inside him had broken that day. He had become quieter and more withdrawn, but those who knew him well could see the rage building under the surface like water behind a dam. There was also Esther, 42 years old, who served as the community's unofficial doctor and midwife. She knew about plants and roots, could stop pain and bring down fevers, and had delivered most of the children born on the plantation in the last 20 years. Her knowledge made her valuable, but it also made Hartwell nervous. He did not like things he could not understand or control, and Esther's skills fell into both groups. Benjamin and Clara were a married couple in their early 30s, parents to 3 children ranging from 4 to 11 years old. Benjamin worked as a carpenter, skilled enough that Hartwell sometimes hired him out to other plantations, keeping the money for himself. Clara worked in the fields during planting and harvest seasons and in the main house kitchen during slower times. They had managed to keep their family unit together, a rare blessing in a system that often separated parents from children and husbands from wives. There was Moses, a quiet man of 40, who had been bought from a plantation in South Carolina 5 years earlier. He had arrived with scars on his back that told a story he never spoke about, and a tiredness in his eyes that suggested he had seen the worst of what the system could do. He kept to himself mostly, but he was strong and reliable, and the other workers had slowly accepted him into their group. Young Lily was 16, pretty in a way that made her unsafe from unwanted attention. Her mother, Sarah, watched her all the time, trying to keep her safe from dangers that were very real. Sarah herself was 34, worn down by years of field work and the constant worry of raising a daughter in a place where young women had no protection from the wants of white men. There was also Jacob, the blacksmith, whose skills made him very important. He was 50 years old, powerfully built despite his age, with hands that could shape iron and a mind that understood mechanics and building. The plantation's tools, the iron parts on wagons and buildings, the horseshoes and hinges, and many other metal needs, all came from Jacob's fire. Hartwell knew Jacob's value, which gave the blacksmith slightly more power than most, though that power was limited and dangerous to use. The other members of the community included Patience, Hannah, Daniel, Elijah, Rebecca, Nathan, Grace, Joseph, Martha, Abigail, and Caleb. Each had their own stories, their own hurts, and their own reasons for what would happen that Christmas morning. They ranged in age from 14 to 56, and in skills from field hands to craftspeople, but they shared a common life under James Hartwell's rule, and that shared life would finally bind them together in an act that none of them could have done alone. James Hartwell III was 41 years old in the winter of 1847. A man of medium height with dark hair starting to turn gray at the sides and pale blue eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He had inherited Riverside at age 23 when his father died of a stroke, and he had run it with a strictness that impressed other planters, even as it worried some of them. Hartwell believed in discipline above everything else, strict schedules, hard punishments for mistakes, and constant watching to stop what he called laziness and disobedience. His wife Margaret was 36, a woman from a well-known Savannah family who had married Hartwell when she was 18. She had given him 4 children, though 2 had died as babies, leaving a son of 12 and a daughter of 9. Margaret was not a cruel woman by nature, but she had been raised in a system that taught her to see enslaved people as property rather than human beings, and she had never seriously questioned that teaching. She ran the house with quiet speed, managing the house workers and keeping up the social duties expected of a plantation wife. The overseer, a man named Dutch Keller, lived in a small house near the east edge of the property. Dutch was 35, originally from Pennsylvania, who had come south looking for work and found a job managing enslaved labor. He was neither the cruelest nor the kindest overseer in the county. He did his job with a business, like coldness, that some found more scary than direct violence. He carried a whip but used it rarely, preferring mental fear and the threat of punishment to constant physical hitting. But when he did use the whip, he used it well, and everyone on the plantation knew it. The winter of 1847 had been very hard. An early frost in October had hurt part of the cotton crop, turning the plants black before they could be fully picked. The loss was a big money blow to Hartwell, who had borrowed a lot to grow his business the year before. The debt weighed on him, made him angry and demanding, and he reacted to the crop loss by pushing everyone harder, making work hours longer, giving less food, and taking away the small rights that had made life a little more bearable. By December, deep tiredness had settled over the cabins like a heavy weight. People moved slower, their bodies worn down by months of extra work and less food. Injuries happened more often. A hand crushed in the machine, a foot cut by a tool, backs hurt by loads that were too heavy. Esther did what she could with her plants and mixes, but some hurts needed rest to heal, and rest was something no one was allowed to have. The mental toll was maybe even bigger than the physical one. There was a feeling of hopelessness that had crept into the community, a feeling that things would never get better, that this hard life would go on until their bodies gave out. Some of the older workers spoke quietly about people they had known who had simply given up, who had lost the will to keep fighting and had faded away despite having no clear sickness. That kind of death scared people more than physical violence because it suggested that the spirit could be broken even when the body remained whole. Christmas had always been different at Riverside, though not in a good way. Most plantations in Georgia gave their enslaved workers a few days of rest during the holiday, a short break that served as much to keep up work speed as to follow tradition. The idea was simple. People who got occasional breaks worked harder during the rest of the year, and the Christmas holiday provided a way to let out steam for tensions that might otherwise build to dangerous levels. But James Hartwell had his own ideas about Christmas. He believed free time created rebellion, that any break in the routine created chances for plotting and planning. He had seen what happened on other farms where workers were given time off. They gathered, they talked. They remembered that they were human beings with thoughts and wants beyond their work. Hartwell found this dangerous, so he had started his own tradition. Christmas at Riverside was a working day like any other, with perhaps a slightly bigger meal in the evening as the only nod to the holiday. This rule had caused trouble with his neighbors, some of whom thought he was being too harsh. Even other slaveholders, men who had no moral issues with slavery itself, thought Hartwell was pushing too hard, creating risks that were not worth the small gain in work. But Hartwell ignored their worries. He knew his property, he would say. He knew what was needed to keep control. On Christmas Eve of 1847, Hartwell made a statement that would prove to be the final push. He gathered everyone in the yard between the cabins and the big house. All 23 enslaved workers, plus Dutch Keller and Margaret, who watched from the porch. The sun was going down, casting long shadows across the red clay, and the temperature was dropping fast as night came. Hartwell stood on the porch steps, higher than the group, and spoke in a voice that carried clearly in the cold air. Tomorrow, he said, there would be no rest. Instead, they would start clearing a new field on the east edge of the land. Work that would need every able body from sunrise until well past dark. The new field was needed because of the crop loss, he explained. They needed to grow more to make up for the loss, and the work needed to start right away to have the land ready for spring planting. He went on to list the expectations. They would clear bushes and small trees, move rocks, and start the process of fixing the soil. It was hard work. the kind that would leave people tired and aching, and doing it in December's cold would make it even harder. But Hartwell was clear that he expected full effort from everyone, and that any laziness would be dealt with harshly. When he finished, he went back inside without waiting for an answer. There was never an answer expected. The people in the yard stood quietly for a moment, thinking about what they had just heard, and then slowly went back to their cabins as darkness fell and the temperature kept dropping. That night, something changed in the cabins. It was not a sudden change, not a dramatic moment of choice, but rather a slow coming together of individual angers into a group understanding. People moved between cabins despite the cold, gathering in small groups, speaking in low voices that would not carry to the main house or to Dutch Keller's house. Samuel, who rarely spoke about the old days, began telling stories about his mother, about traditions she had kept alive even in slavery. He talked about fighting back, not the violent kind that led to hangings and brutal punishment, but the quiet kind that kept dignity and humanity alive in the face of cruelty. He spoke about the need for community, for standing together, for remembering that they were people, not things, no matter what the law said. Ruth, who usually kept to herself, moved between the cabins with a goal that others noticed but did not question. She carried news, things she had heard in the main house, details about Hartwell's money troubles, knowledge about the family's weak spots. She did not say exactly what should be done with this news, but she made sure people knew it, understood the full picture of their situation. Thomas sat outside his cabin despite the cold, staring at the main house with a look that made the older workers worried. His anger was clear, barely held in, and there was worry that he might do something rash, something that would bring down violence on everyone. But when people came to him, tried to talk him down, they found that his anger had turned into something colder and more planned. He was not interested in violence, he told them. Violence would do nothing except get people killed. But there were other ways to fight back, other ways to make Hartwell understand what he had done. Esther moved through the cabins with her medicine bag, treating hurts and sickness, but also listening, watching, understanding the mood that was building. She had seen this before years ago on a different farm, and she knew it could go in several directions, toward violence, toward sadness, or toward something else. Something that needed courage and teamwork, and a willingness to risk everything for a chance at dignity. Benjamin and Clara gathered their children close, speaking to them in whispers about the value of family, of staying together no matter what happened. The children did not fully understand what was being said, but they felt the tension, the feeling that something big was about to happen. Moses, the quiet man from South Carolina, finally spoke about his past. He told about a plantation where he had seen people pushed too far, where hopelessness had led to a violent uprising that had been crushed with huge force. He had survived that uprising, had the scars to prove it, and he wanted everyone to understand what happened when resistance turned violent. The authorities did not separate leaders from followers, those who had fought from those who had simply been there. Everyone suffered, everyone paid the price. If they were going to resist, he said, it had to be smart. It had to be something that could not be easily crushed with guns and dogs and the full weight of the law. Jacob the blacksmith talked about leverage. He understood power, understood that Hartwell's control depended on their help, their work, their willingness to accept their given roles. What if they simply stopped helping? What if they refused to play their parts in the system? It would be dangerous, for sure, but it might also work in ways that violence never could. The talks went on through the night, moving from cabin to cabin, involving everyone in the group. There were disagreements, of course. Some people thought any resistance was too dangerous, that they should simply bear it as they always had. Others wanted more dramatic action, wanted to strike back in ways that would hurt Hartwell as much as he had hurt them. But slowly, through hours of talk and debate, a plan formed. They would resist, but not with violence. They would make a stand, but not one that would give the authorities an excuse to destroy them. They would do something that had never been done before, something that would force Hartwell and everyone else to see them as human beings making a choice, not as property that was broken. The plan that came out was simple in idea, but would need huge courage and discipline to do. On Christmas morning, when the bell rang to call them to work, they would gather in the yard as usual. But then, instead of going to the new field, they would simply stand there. They would not work. They would not speak. They would not make demands or make threats. They would just stand silently, refusing to move, refusing to aid, forcing Hartwell to face the reality that his control was a fake idea that depended on their consent. It was a plan that could easily fail, that could lead to violence and suffering, but it was also a plan that kept their dignity, that made a statement about their humanity without giving the authorities an easy excuse for harsh punishment. If they were going to resist, this was how they would do it. Not as violent rebels, but as human beings showing their right to be seen and heard. As the night went on and the temperature dropped more, the 23 made their choice. Each person had to choose alone. No one could be forced or pressured into joining, but one by one they agreed. They would stand together on Christmas morning. They would face whatever happened. And they would do it as a community, supporting each other, refusing to let Hartwell break them one by one. The temperature dropped as midnight came. Frost formed on the cabin roofs, shining in the moonlight like broken glass. Inside the main house, James Hartwell slept in his second-floor bedroom, his wife Margaret in the room beside his, their 2 children in the nursery down the hall. The house was quiet, warm, safe from the December cold by thick walls and heavy curtains. Hartwell had no idea what was being planned in the cabins behind his house, no sense that the morning would bring something that would change everything. Christmas morning arrived with a pale gray light that turned the frost, covered fields into something almost pretty. The air was still and cold, so cold that breath came out in thick clouds, and skin stung within seconds. The bell that usually rang at 5:00 to wake the workers remained silent, not because of any choice by Hartwell, but because Dutch Keller, who normally rang it, had overslept a little, thrown off by the holiday. In the cabins, people were already awake. They had slept little, if at all, and now they prepared themselves for what was coming. They dressed in their warmest clothes, thin as those were. They gathered in small groups, giving each other quiet words of support. Samuel led a prayer, asking for strength and courage, asking that whatever happened, they would face it together. At 5:30, Dutch Keller finally rang the bell, the sound cutting through the cold morning air. Normally, people would come out of their cabins quickly, knowing that delays meant punishment. But this morning they emerged slowly, deliberately gathering in the yard between the cabins and the main house. They arranged themselves in a loose half, circle facing the house, and then they simply stood there waiting. Dutch Keller noticed right away that something was wrong. The usual morning routine, people gathering their tools, getting into work groups, getting ready for the day's work, was not happening. Instead, everyone was just standing there, silent and still, their faces calm, but their eyes alert. Dutch walked to them, demanded to know what was going on, why they were not preparing for work. No one answered. No one even looked at him directly. They just stood there, their silence more disturbing than any words could have been. Dutch went to the main house, climbed the porch steps, and knocked on the door. It took several minutes for anyone to answer. The house was just waking up, and Christmas morning, even at Riverside, usually started a little later than other days. Finally, Margaret opened the door, still in her nightgown and robe, her hair down. Dutch explained the situation, his voice tight with stress. Margaret's face went pale, and she immediately went upstairs to wake her husband. James Hartwell dressed fast, came down the stairs, and stepped out onto the front porch. The sight that met him would become the subject of many retellings, each version slightly different, but all agreeing on the main facts. 3 people stood in the yard between the cabins and the main house. They were not working, they were not moving. They were simply standing, arranged in a loose curve facing the house. Their hands were empty. Their faces were calm, and they were completely, utterly silent. For a moment, Hartwell just stared, trying to understand what he was seeing. Then his face turned red, and he began shouting. He demanded they get to work right now. He threatened punishments, whipping, less food, sail to the deep south where conditions were even harder. His voice echoed across the yard, bouncing off the cabins and fading into the cotton fields beyond. The 23 people did not move, they did not speak, they just stood there watching him with looks that showed nothing. Hartwell's first response was anger, the quick fury of a man whose power had been challenged. He shouted orders, demanded reasons, threatened outcomes that would make them regret this act. He called out individual names, trying to break the group's silence by picking out single voices. "Samuel, you are the oldest here. Tell me what this is about." Silence. "Ruth, you work in my house. You know better than this." Silence. "Thomas, are you behind this? Is this your doing?" Silence. The silence was total, unbroken, and it was more scary than any shouted words would have been. Hartwell was used to resistance that he could understand. People who talked back, who argued, who showed their anger in ways that gave reason for his punishments. But this silent refusal to join in, this group withdrawal of help, was something he had no way to understand. Margaret Hartwell appeared at the door behind her husband, drawn by his shouting. She took in the scene, the 23 people standing silently in the yard, her husband's red face and tight fists, the tension that seemed to thicken the cold air, and immediately went back inside. She gathered the children and took them upstairs, away from whatever was about to happen. She understood, perhaps before her husband did, that something basic had changed, that the normal rules and patterns no longer applied. For 3 hours the standoff went on. Hartwell switched between threats and promises, between rage and forced calm. He tried everything he could think of to break the silence. He promised better treatment if they went back to work right away. He threatened to sell them all, to break up families, to make their lives so miserable they would beg for mercy. He spoke to individuals he thought might be more open to pressure. He tried reasoning, explaining the money needs that required their labor. Nothing worked. The sun rose higher, burning off the frost, and still the 23 stood their ground. Dutch Keller stood on the porch beside Hartwell, his hand resting on the whip at his belt, but he made no move to use it. He understood, perhaps better than Hartwell, that violence at this moment would be a mistake. The group was not threatening anyone, was not breaking property, was not doing anything that clearly justified brutal punishment. They were simply standing there, and attacking them for that would make Hartwell look like the attacker, would create sympathy for them that might spread to other plantations. Around 9:00, Hartwell sent Dutch to get the sheriff from the county seat. Dutch saddled a horse and rode hard, covering the 12 miles in less than an hour. Sheriff William Crawford was at home with his family getting ready for a Christmas meal when Dutch arrived with news of the situation at Riverside. Crawford listened to Dutch's description, asked a few questions, and then gathered 3 deputies and rode back with Dutch to the plantation. Sheriff William Crawford arrived at Riverside shortly after 11:00. He was a man in his early 50s, heavy, set, with gray hair and a face worn by years of outdoor work. He had been sheriff for 15 years, had dealt with runaway slaves and small rebellions before, and he approached the situation with a mix of care and confidence. He expected to find something that required force to solve, armed fighters perhaps, or property damage that would justify arrests and harsh punishment. What Crawford found instead was something that unsettled him more than direct rebellion would have. The enslaved workers were not armed, they had not destroyed property or threatened violence, they had not even spoken. They were simply refusing to work, refusing to acknowledge the power that had ruled their entire lives. It was quiet resistance before that term existed, and it terrified the white men who saw it because they had no way to understand it. Crawford got off his horse and walked to the group, keeping his voice level and his hand away from his weapon. He was known as a reasonable man by the standards of his time and place, someone who preferred talk to violence when possible. He built his name on being able to calm tense situations, to find answers that avoided bloodshed while still keeping the social order. "I am Sheriff Crawford," he said, speaking to the group as a whole since no single person had been named as a leader. "I need to understand what is happening here. What do you want? What would end this standoff?" The silence that met him was total. 3 pairs of eyes watched him, but not a single mouth opened to answer. Crawford tried again, using a different way. "I know Christmas is a hard day to work. Most places give folks time off. Maybe Mr. Hartwell could rethink. Give you the day to rest, and we can all move past this." Still nothing. The silence stretched out, becoming uncomfortable, heavy. Crawford looked back at Hartwell, who stood on the porch with his arms crossed, his face still red with anger. "James, maybe we should talk about this. Maybe there is a middle ground here." Hartwell's answer was quick and sharp. "There is no middle ground. They work or they face the results. I will not be told what to do by my own property." Crawford winced at the words, not out of moral issue, but because he understood that Hartwell's attitude was making the situation worse. The sheriff had dealt with enough tense situations to know that hard positions led to violence, and violence here would be a disaster, even if they could force the workers back to their labor, and he was not sure they could without killing some of them. The story would spread. Other plantations would hear about it. The enslaved communities throughout the county would learn that resistance was possible, that group action could challenge the system. That was something Crawford desperately wanted to avoid. By afternoon, word had spread to nearby plantations. Other owners arrived, some out of curiosity, others out of worry that whatever was happening at Riverside might spread to their own lands. They gathered on Hartwell's porch, talking about options in low voices, while the 23 kept their watch in the yard. The plantation owners who arrived represented a mix of the county's rich. There was Robert Finch, who owned a large plantation to the north and was known for his relatively gentle treatment of his workers. He gave them Christmas off, allowed them small garden plots, and rarely used physical punishment. There was Thomas Gaines, whose plantation to the south was run with discipline nearly as hard as Hartwell's. There was William Prescott, an older man who had inherited his plantation and ran it more out of tradition than love. And there were several others, each bringing their own views and worries. The talk on the porch was heated. Finch argued that Hartwell should simply give them the day off, let them have their Christmas rest, and deal with discipline issues later. "You are creating a situation that does not need to exist," he told Hartwell. "Give them what they want today, and tomorrow you can take back control. But if you push this to violence, you will regret it." Gaines disagreed. "If we give in to this, we are finished. Every plantation in the county will face the same thing." They will learn that if they just stand there and refuse to work, we will cave. We have to make an example here. Show them that this kind of act has consequences." Prescott, the older man, offered a different view. "I have been doing this for 40 years, and I have never seen anything quite like this. They are not rebelling in the normal way. They are not violent. They are just refusing. I do not know what the right answer is, but I know that whatever we do here will be remembered. We need to think carefully." The debate went on for hours with no agreement coming. Some of the owners were genuinely worried about the example this would set. Others were more worried about the practical issues if this spread to their plantations. How would they keep up work? How would they keep control? The system they had built their lives and fortunes on depended on obedience, on the acceptance by enslaved people of their given roles. What happened when that acceptance was taken away? As the sun began its drop toward the horizon, something amazing happened. The enslaved workers from 2 neighboring plantations, people who had been given Christmas Day off, began arriving at Riverside. They did not join the silent protest, but they placed themselves at the edges of the property, watching. Their presence added a new layer to the standoff, a suggestion that what was happening here mattered beyond these 23 individuals. The watchers from other plantations did not speak or step in. They simply stood at the property lines, their presence a silent statement of support or curiosity or both. Their masters noticed right away and were deeply upset. This was exactly what they had feared. The spread of the idea, the sense that what was happening at Riverside mattered to enslaved people throughout the region. The temperature dropped with the coming darkness. Margaret Hartwell, watching from an upstairs window, made a decision. She had food and water brought out and placed in the yard within reach of the 23. It was an act of basic humanity, a knowing that whatever was happening, these were still people who needed food, but the food and water were refused. The 23 did not move toward it, did not look at it. They kept their positions, their silence, their group refusal to engage. The sheriff's deputies built a fire near the main house, trying to stay warm. As the night closed in, the plantation owners who had gathered earlier began to leave, heading back to their own properties, with stories that would grow in the telling. The watchers at the property edges slowly left as darkness fell, though some remained, their presence marked by small fires they built to fight off the cold. And still the 23 stood in the yard, silent and unmoving, their breath visible in the cold air like spirits leaving their bodies. They had been standing for more than 12 hours now, and the physical toll was clear. Some swayed slightly, fighting tiredness. Others shifted their weight from foot to foot, trying to keep blood moving in the cold, but no one broke lines. No one spoke. No one gave Hartwell the joy of seeing them fail. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror in Riverside grows. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and do not forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let us discover together what happens next. What happened next would be the source of the biggest argument, the detail that would be fought over in courtrooms and newspapers for months to come. Around 7:00, as full darkness settled over the plantation, James Hartwell made a choice. He went into his house, climbed to the second floor, and got a rifle from his study. It was a well-kept weapon, a hunting rifle he used for deer and other game, and he loaded it with practiced skill. When he returned to the porch, the rifle in his hands changed the feeling immediately. The deputies tensed. The few remaining plantation owners who had stayed to see how this would end exchanged worried looks. Sheriff Crawford stepped forward, his hand raised in a calming way. "James, let us think about this. Let us not do anything we will regret." Hartwell did not answer the sheriff. He raised the weapon, pointed it at the sky, and fired a single shot into the air. The sound shattered the silence like glass breaking, echoing across the plantation and into the surrounding woods. Birds flew from trees, the horses in the stable neighed in alarm, and for a moment everything froze. The sheriff and his deputies, the remaining plantation owners, the watchers at the property's edges, and then slowly, deliberately, the 23 people in the yard turned and walked back to their cabins. They did not run, they did not speak. They simply withdrew, leaving the yard empty, except for the marks their feet had made in the frost, softened ground. They moved as a group, keeping their collective bond even in retreat, and disappeared into their cabins, closing the doors behind them. Hartwell lowered his rifle, his face red with what might have been victory or relief or something more complicated. He declared the situation solved and invited the other owners inside for drinks. They accepted, though several of them looked troubled, unsure whether what they just witnessed represented a win or something else entirely. The sheriff and his deputies remained outside, uneasy about the ending, but unsure what else to do. Crawford walked to the cabins, intending to speak with someone to understand what had just happened and whether it was truly over. But when he knocked on doors, no one answered. The cabins were silent, dark, giving no sign of what was happening inside. The watchers from neighboring plantations slowly left, heading back to their own homes with stories that would grow as they were told. By morning, everyone in the county would know that something had happened at Riverside, though the details would vary depending on who was telling the story. Inside the main house, Hartwell poured whiskey for his guests and tried to show confidence. He had handled the situation, he insisted. He had shown them who was in control. Tomorrow things would return to normal, and this whole event would be forgotten. But even as he spoke, there was a weakness to his confidence, a sense that he was trying to convince himself as much as his audience. Margaret Hartwell stayed upstairs with the children, unwilling to join in her husband's celebration. She had watched the entire day unfold from her window, had seen the silent standoff, had witnessed her husband's growing desperation, and she understood that something had broken. The system they had lived under, the ideas they had made about control and power, had been challenged in a way that could not be easily dismissed or forgotten. In the cabins, the 23 gathered in Samuel's cabin, the largest of the structures. They spoke in whispers, processing what had happened, discussing what would come next. They had made their stand, had kept it for more than 12 hours, and had withdrawn on their own terms rather than being forced back to work. It was not a complete victory. They would still have to work tomorrow, would still be enslaved, would still face Hartwell's power, but they had proven something important. They could act together, could resist in ways that did not give the authorities easy reason for brutal punishment, could force the white men who claimed to own them to see them as human beings making choices. But they also understood that there would be costs. Hartwell would not simply forget what had happened. He would find ways to punish them, to take back his control, to make sure they understood that their act of resistance had a price. The question was what form those costs would take, and whether they would be aimed at individuals or at the community as a whole. Samuel, speaking in the low, steady tones that commanded respect, reminded everyone of what they had done. "We stood together," he said. "For 12 hours we stood as one. They could not break us. They could not make us speak. They could not force us back to work. That matters. That will be remembered." Ruth added her own view. "I have been in that house for years, and I have never seen Mr. Hartwell like he was today. He was frightened. Underneath all that anger, he was scared because he realized his control is not total. We showed him that." Thomas, the young man whose anger had been a worry, spoke with surprising calm. "My mother was taken from me because Mr. Hartwell needed money. He sold her like she was a piece of furniture. Today, we showed him that we are not furniture. We are people, and people can choose not to help." The conversation went on late into the night, with everyone adding their thoughts and feelings about what had happened. There was pride in what they had done, but also worry about what would come next. They had crossed a line, had challenged the system in a way that could not be undone, and they knew that Hartwell would respond. What they did not know, what they could not have known, was that the real resistance was just beginning, and that the Christmas morning standoff would be remembered not as the end of their story, but as the opening act. The morning after Christmas, the bell rang at 5:00 as usual. The field workers were expected to begin the clearing project that had been delayed, but when Dutch Keller went to the cabins to wake the workers, he found them empty. Not abandoned, personal things remained, the few items each person owned still in their places. The blankets were neatly folded. The small carved figures and precious items were arranged carefully on shelves, but the people themselves were gone. All 23 had vanished in the night. Dutch stood in the doorway of Samuel's cabin, staring at the empty space, trying to understand what he was seeing. He checked each cabin in turn, finding the same thing in each one. Empty but not messy, everything was tidy, peaceful, as if the people had simply stepped out for a moment and would return shortly, but Dutch knew they were not coming back. Somehow, impossibly, 23 people had disappeared from a guarded plantation without leaving any sign of their leaving. He ran to the main house, pounding on the door with enough force to wake the entire household. James Hartwell appeared at the door in his nightshirt, his hair messy, his face still heavy with sleep. "What is it?" he demanded, annoyed at being woken so early. "They are gone," Dutch said, his voice tight with tension. "All of them? Every single one. The cabins are empty." Hartwell's face went from annoyed to confused to fury in the space of seconds. He pushed past Dutch and ran to the cabins, checking each one himself, as if Dutch might have somehow missed 23 people. But the cabins were indeed empty, and the reality of the situation began to sink in. The discovery sent Hartwell into a fury that his wife would later describe as scary in its strength. He immediately organized a search party, pulling together every available man from Riverside and sending word to the surrounding plantations for help. Sheriff Crawford was called again, this time bringing a larger force and a pack of tracking dogs. The search began at dawn and continued through the day, covering the woods surrounding the plantation, the banks of the Oconee River, the roads leading to nearby towns. They found nothing, no tracks, no signs of passage, no indication of which direction the group had gone. The tracking dogs were brought to the cabins, given items with the missing workers' scent, and set loose to find a trail. But the dogs circled the cabins whining in confusion and could not pick up any trail leading away from the plantation. It was as if 23 people had simply dissolved into the winter air, leaving behind only the mystery of their departure. The search expanded over the following days. Guards were set on all the major roads. River crossings were watched. Notices were posted in towns throughout Middle Georgia describing the missing workers and offering big rewards for information. Hartwell hired extra men to search the countryside, convinced that a group that large could not simply disappear without leaving some trace. The descriptions in the notices were detailed. Samuel, 50, 6 years old, bent back, graying hair. Ruth, 30, 8, light-skinned, worked in the main house. Thomas, 19, tall and strong. Each of the 23 was described in terms that reduced them to physical traits and money value, the language of property rather than people. The rewards offered were large, enough money to tempt anyone who might have information. But weeks passed with no discoveries. The cabins at Riverside remained empty, their doors hanging open, their insides slowly gathering dust and dead leaves blown in by winter winds. The plantation's work continued with hired laborers and workers borrowed from neighboring properties, but the absence of the 23 hung over everything like a question that refused to be answered. Theories grew throughout the county and beyond. Some believed the group had been helped by anti-slavery people, spirited away on the Underground Railroad that was rumored to have routes through Georgia, though most of those routes ran much further north, and the task of moving 23 people at once seemed nearly impossible. Others suggested they had fled to the swamps of southern Georgia, where runaways could hide for years in the trackless wetlands, living off the land and avoiding detection. A few whispered darker possibilities that they had been killed by someone, their bodies hidden where they would never be found, though who would have done this and why remained unclear. James Hartwell became obsessed with finding them. He spent huge sums on the search, hiring professional slave catchers and investigators, following leads that always led nowhere. His behavior grew strange. Workers on the plantation reported hearing him walking the grounds at night, calling out names, demanding answers from the darkness. He would stand in the empty cabins, staring at the left-behind items, trying to understand how this had happened under his watch. His wife grew concerned enough to write to his brother in Savannah, asking for help managing both the plantation and her husband's falling state. The brother came for a visit in late January, spent a week at Riverside, and left deeply troubled by what he had seen. James had lost weight, was not sleeping, and had developed a suspicious edge that made him difficult to be around. He was convinced that someone knew where the 23 had gone, that there was a plot of silence protecting them, and he questioned anyone who came to the plantation with an intensity that bordered on madness. The money impact of the disappearance was big. 23 workers represented a large investment, and their loss came at a time when Hartwell was already struggling with debt from the previous year's crop failure. He had borrowed money to buy several of the workers, and those debts remained even though the workers were gone. Insurance did not cover runaways, and there was no legal way that would recover his losses. The plantation's output dropped sharply, and Hartwell was forced to borrow more money to hire replacement labor, digging himself deeper into money trouble. Then, in late February, a discovery was made that would deepen the mystery rather than solve it. A farmer named Josiah Perkins, clearing land about 8 miles from Riverside, found something buried in a shallow hole near a creek. It was a collection of items, 23 small bundles, each carefully wrapped in cloth and tied with string. Perkins, curious, opened one of the bundles and found a carved wooden figure, the kind of thing a child might play with or an adult might keep as a memory. Perkins brought the items to the sheriff, who immediately recognized their potential meaning. Crawford brought the bundles to Riverside, where Margaret Hartwell and Dutch Keller looked at them. Several were immediately recognizable. There was Samuel's carving, a small figure of a man that he had worked on for years, adding details and refinements. There was a piece of cloth with careful stitching that Ruth recognized as belonging to her sister. There was a smooth river stone that Thomas had carried since childhood, a gift from his mother before she was sold away. Each bundle contained something personal, something precious, something that would have been treasured by its owner. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Why would people fleeing for their lives take the time to bury their most precious possessions? What did the burial mean, and how had they managed to do this without being detected? The place where the bundles were found was along a route that search parties had covered many times, yet no one had noticed any signs of recent digging or disturbance. A local minister, Reverend Elijah Thorne, was asked about the discovery. He suggested it might be a ritual of some kind, a symbolic leaving behind of their old lives. Many African traditions, he explained, involved burial of significant objects to mark changes or transformations. Perhaps the 23 had performed such a ritual before fleeing, marking their leaving of slavery and their journey toward freedom. But that explanation satisfied no one. If they were starting new lives elsewhere, why not take these items with them? These were their most precious possessions, the things that connected them to their past, to their families, to their identities. Why bury them in a random location, miles from the plantation? And why bury them together in a single stash, rather than each person getting rid of their own items? Hartwell became fixed on the burial site. He visited it repeatedly, sometimes spending hours there, staring at the ground as if it might yield up its secrets through sheer force of will. He had the area dug up more thoroughly, hoping to find more clues, but nothing else was discovered. The bundles remained the only physical proof of where the 23 had gone and what they had done after leaving Riverside. Spring arrived, bringing its own demands and distractions. The plantation needed to be prepared for planting, and Hartwell was forced to focus on practical matters. Even as his obsession with the missing workers continued to eat at him, he hired more workers, both enslaved people bought from other plantations and free laborers who needed work. But the new workers were uneasy at Riverside, sensing something wrong in the empty cabins and their boss's strange behavior. In May, there was a potential break. A traveling merchant passing through the county claimed to have seen a group matching the description of the missing workers in Tennessee, working on a farm owned by a Quaker family known for their anti-slavery views. Hartwell immediately traveled to Tennessee, bringing Sheriff Crawford and 2 deputies with him. They found the farm, found workers there who had clearly escaped from slavery, but none of them were from Riverside. The merchant, it turned out, had been wrong, or had been seeking the reward money with false information. The failed trip to Tennessee seemed to break something in Hartwell. He returned to Riverside, more withdrawn, less vocal about his determination to find the missing workers. He continued the plantation's work, but with a robotic efficiency that suggested he was going through the motions rather than truly engaging with the work. Margaret noticed the change and was relieved by it, hoping that her husband was finally accepting the loss and moving on. But she also noticed that he still walked the grounds at night, still stood in the empty cabins, still seemed to be waiting for something. Summer passed, then fall. The cotton crop that year was okay. Not a disaster, but not profitable enough to significantly reduce Hartwell's debts. He sold off some land to raise cash, reducing the plantation's size for the first time in 3 generations. Neighbors noticed the decline and whispered about it, some with pity, others with a joy that came from seeing a proud man brought low. In August, a traveling preacher passing through the area claimed to have information about the missing workers. He said he had met a group matching their description in Alabama, working on a plantation owned by a man who asked no questions about where his workers came from. Hartwell paid the preacher for the information and sent Dutch Keller to check. Dutch traveled to Alabama, found the plantation, but once again, none of the workers there were from Riverside. The pattern repeated itself over the following months. Someone would claim to have seen the missing workers. Hartwell would pay for the information or send someone to check, and the lead would prove false. Each disappointment took a toll, wearing away at Hartwell's health and mind. By the winter of 1848, a year after the Christmas morning standoff, he was a shadow of the man he had been. He had lost weight. His hair had gone almost completely gray, and he moved with the careful slowness of someone much older than his 42 years. The years passed. The Civil War came and went, bringing its own changes and upheavals. Riverside Plantation survived the war, but never fully recovered its old wealth. The Emancipation Proclamation and the Union victory ended slavery, transforming the entire money and social system that plantations had been built on. James Hartwell died in 169 at the age of 63, his obsession with the missing 23 unresolved. His death certificate listed the cause as heart failure, but those who had known him in his final years understood that he had been dying slowly for over 20 years, eaten up by the mystery he could not solve. His wife sold the property and moved to Atlanta, wanting to escape the memories that haunted every corner of the land. The plantation was bought by a family named Patterson, originally from Pennsylvania, who had come south after the war, seeking chances in the changed economy. They hired freedmen to work the land, paying wages instead of owning people, trying to build something new from the ruins of the old system. Among their workers was an old man named Samuel, who had shown up one day in the spring of 172, asking for work. He was in his early 80s by then, his back more bent than ever, his hands twisted with arthritis, but he proved himself knowledgeable about cotton growing and the specific nature of the riverside soil. The Pattersons hired him, giving him light duties right for his age, and he became a fixture on the plantation, respected by the other workers and valued by his bosses. It took 3 years before anyone made the connection. A former neighbor visiting the Pattersons in the summer of 175 recognized Samuel as one of the missing 23. The news sparked immediate interest. Where had he been? What had happened to the others? How had they managed to disappear so completely? Samuel, now in his mid-80s, agreed to tell his story, but only on his own terms. He gathered a small group, the Pattersons, a lawyer from the county seat named Marcus Brennan, and a journalist from Atlanta named Henry Whitfield, who had heard about the case and traveled to Riverside to investigate. On a cold December evening in 175, exactly 28 years after the Christmas morning standoff, Samuel finally broke his silence. They met in the main house at Riverside, in the same room where James Hartwell had once entertained the plantation owners who had come to see the standoff. Samuel sat in a comfortable chair by the fireplace, a blanket over his legs, and began to speak in a voice that was quiet but clear, telling a story that would challenge everything people thought they understood about the disappearance. What Samuel revealed that night would become one of the most remarkable stories of resistance in American history. The 23 had not fled to the north. They had not been killed or hidden in the swamps. They had been at Riverside the entire time. The plantation, Samuel explained, had something most people did not know about, a network of old storage cellars and tunnels beneath the main house and several of the outbuildings. They had been built by James Hartwell II during the War of 1812, intended as hiding places for valuables in case of British attack. The cellars were reached through hidden entrances in the floors of certain buildings, and they connected to each other through narrow tunnels that had been dug through the red clay soil. Over the decades, the cellars had been largely forgotten. James Hartwell III knew they existed. He had been shown them as a child, but he rarely thought about them and never used them. New building and piled-up junk had hidden some of the entrances, and the cellars had become just another forgotten feature of an old plantation. But Samuel had known about them. His mother, who had worked in the main house during James Hartwell II's time, had shown him the cellars when he was a boy. She had explained that they were secret places, that knowledge of them should be kept within the enslaved community, passed down carefully from generation to generation. Samuel had kept that knowledge, had shown the cellars to a few trusted people over the years, and had always understood that they might someday be useful. On Christmas night, after Hartwell fired his rifle and everyone went back to the cabins, the 23 had gathered in the darkness and made their decision. They would disappear, but not by fleeing. They would hide beneath the plantation itself, living in the cellars and tunnels, and they would watch what happened when James Hartwell realized his property had vanished. They had been preparing for weeks, Samuel explained. Ever since Hartwell had announced there would be no Christmas rest, they had been gathering supplies and planning. Ruth had stolen food from the main house kitchen in small amounts that would not be noticed. Jacob had quietly set aside tools and materials. Esther had collected herbs and medicines. Benjamin had prepared the cellars, clearing out trash and making them livable. By Christmas night, everything was ready. The entrances to the cellars were in several locations. One was in the floor of an old storage shed that was rarely used. Another was beneath a loose floorboard in the barn. A third was hidden under a pile of firewood near the blacksmith's forge. The 23 had slipped into the cellars in small groups throughout Christmas night, moving silently through the darkness. And by dawn they were all underground, hidden beneath the very plantation that was searching for them. The journalist Henry Whitfield stopped him at this point, asking the obvious question, why? Why hide beneath the plantation instead of actually fleeing? Why take such a huge risk when they could have used the same planning and teamwork to escape to the north? Samuel's answer was simple and crushing. They had wanted to see what would happen. They had wanted to watch James Hartwell destroy himself searching for them. They had wanted him to understand in the most real way possible what it felt like to lose control over people he considered his property. And they had wanted to prove to themselves that they could resist, that they could use power and make choices even in the most crushing circumstances. For 3 months, Samuel continued, they had lived in those tunnels. The conditions were hard. The cellars were cold, damp, and dark. They had to ration their supplies carefully, making the food and water last as long as possible. They could not make noise during the day when people might hear them. They had to handle waste and keep clean in small spaces. It was uncomfortable, often miserable, but it was also empowering in a way that none of them had felt before. They had come out only at night, moving through the darkness to gather extra food and water, to breathe fresh air, to keep their strength. The main house had several entrances to the cellars, and they had used these to get into the kitchen and storage areas. They had watched through hidden openings as Hartwell raged and searched and slowly fell apart. They had listened to his nighttime walks, his shouted demands for answers, and they had felt something that had been denied to them their entire lives. Power. Ruth had been especially valuable during this time, Samuel explained. Her knowledge of the main house, her understanding of the family's routines, had allowed them to move through the building without being caught. She had known which floorboards creaked, which doors were kept locked, which rooms were used at which times. She had guided others through the house at night, showing them how to take what they needed without leaving clear traces. The buried items, Samuel explained, had been a message, a way of saying they had left their old lives behind without actually leaving the land. It was symbolic and practical at once, a ritual that marked their change from property to people making their own choices. They had buried the items together in a place that had no special meaning, because the act itself was what mattered, not the location. Marcus Brennan, the lawyer, asked about the details. How had they managed their movements? How had they avoided being found for so long? Samuel smiled, a rare look that changed his worn face, and explained that it had required careful planning and discipline. They had made rules. No one moved alone. Everyone had a partner who would notice if something went wrong. They had created schedules for when different people would emerge, ensuring that the cellars were never completely empty in case someone needed to hide quickly. They had developed signals, patterns of knocks and taps that allowed them to talk through the floors and walls. The most dangerous moments, Samuel said, had come when search parties had walked directly over their hiding places. They had heard the footsteps above, the voices of men searching for them, and they had to remain absolutely silent, barely breathing, terrified that some sound would give them away. But the searchers had never thought to look beneath the buildings. had never imagined that the missing workers might be hiding right under their feet. In late March, when the search had finally died down and Hartwell's attention had turned to other matters, the 23 had begun leaving in small groups, 2 or 3 at a time, spacing their departures over several weeks. They had slipped away from Riverside and made their way to various places. Some had gone north, using the underground railroad routes that did exist, though they were dangerous and uncertain. Some had gone to cities where they could disappear into free black communities, taking new names and building new lives. Some, like Samuel, had eventually returned to Georgia, waiting until enough time had passed that they could live openly without fear of being connected to the disappearance. Henry Whitfield asked about the others. Where were they now? Were they still alive? Samuel's expression became guarded. He would not reveal that information, he said. Some secrets needed to be kept. Some people deserve to live their lives without being defined by what they had done on one Christmas morning in 1847. He had agreed to tell his own story because he was old, because the people who might have punished him were dead, and because he wanted the truth to be known, but he would not betray the others, would not expose them to potential consequences even decades after the fact. The story Samuel told that night was published in the Atlanta Constitution in January of 1876. It caused a stir, not just in Georgia, but throughout the South and North. Some people called it a trick, insisting that Samuel was lying or confused, that the story was too incredible to be true. Others saw it as a powerful symbol of resistance, a proof that enslaved people had found ways to fight back that went beyond the violent rebellions that had terrified white Southerners for generations. Investigators were sent to Riverside to check Samuel's claims about the tunnels. They found them exactly as he had described, a network of underground spaces beneath the main house and outbuildings with hidden entrances that had been carefully kept despite their supposed abandonment. Evidence of recent living was found, makeshift beds made from old blankets, empty food containers, even a few personal items that matched descriptions of belongings owned by the missing 23. The physical proof confirmed Samuel's story, silencing most of the doubters. The discovery of the tunnels and the proof of Samuel's account forced a rethink of what had happened at Riverside. This was not just a story of people fleeing slavery. It was a story of mind warfare, of enslaved people using their knowledge and intelligence to torment their oppressor in ways that were more effective than violence could have been. They turned Hartwell's own property against him, had hidden in the very foundations of his power, and had watched as he destroyed himself trying to find them. James Hartwell's widow, Margaret, was interviewed by Henry Whitfield in the spring of 1876. She was living in Atlanta by then, remarried to a banker named Charles Drummond, trying to build a life separate from her plantation past. When asked about Samuel's news, she was quiet for a long moment before answering. She said she had always suspected something like this, though she had never been able to say exactly what. The way the search had found nothing, the way her husband had seemed to sense their presence without ever finding them. It had felt wrong, she said, like they were being watched by invisible eyes. She had mentioned this to James several times, but he dismissed her worries as female nerves, insisting that the workers had fled and would eventually be found. She also revealed something she had never told anyone. On several occasions during those 3 months, she had found small things moved in the main house. A book placed differently on a shelf, a curtain tied back that she was certain had been closed, food missing from the kitchen in amounts too small to be noticed unless you were paying close attention. At the time, she had blamed it on her own distraction or to servants being careless. Now she understood that the 23 had been moving through the house at night, taking what they needed, leaving traces of their presence that only someone looking for them would notice. Margaret also spoke about her husband's decline. The obsession with finding the missing workers had consumed him, she said, had taken over his life in ways that destroyed his health and his relationships. He had become paranoid, suspicious of everyone, convinced that people were lying to him or hiding information. He had spent huge sums on the search, had neglected the plantation's work, had driven away friends and family with his strange behavior. By the time he died, he was isolated and broken, a man who had been defeated not by violence, but by his own inability to accept that his control had been a fake idea. The revelation of what